My guest today is John Kagia. John is now the Acting Executive Director for the Office of Cannabis Management. As the prior Director of Policy at OCM, John led the team responsible for policy development and implementation for the medical, adult use, and hemp programs in New York. He also managed the development of research and data systems to measure and track industry performance. John joined the cannabis industry in 2014, where he was a pioneering industry analyst delivering groundbreaking research into emerging global markets, investment and capital flows, supply chain trends, product innovation, and evolving consumer behavior, all of which we have seen in practice at the monthly cannabis control meetings, where his reports have become must-stream TV for those in the industry. Welcome, John.
It's a pleasure to be here, Herb.
Oh, well, thank you for making the time today. It's great to have you. Looking at your background, I see you have not moved into the new office.
Well, given how much the Office of Cannabis Management has grown over the last couple of years, we're now at over 260 staff. Mm-hmm. Our offices are actually packed to capacity. So I'm still in my old office while we figure out kind of our personnel configurations. We're certainly going to need to grow into bigger office spaces as a team, but the work goes on regardless of where I'm sitting to do the work.
All right, so depending on how you look at it, you're either the third or fourth person to lead the Office of Cannabis Management since OCM came into being at the end of 2021. Chris Alexander resigned following a difficult start to legal sales. Then Felicia Reed departed in December 2025, followed by Susan Filburn in an interim capacity. How will your tenure be different? What will you do differently that your predecessors either couldn't or didn't?
Well, it's a great question, and I think an important one. And maybe I would approach it first by thinking about the role of the executive director in the context of where the agency is and where the market that we're governing is in its evolution. The inaugural executive director, Chris Alexander, was literally building an agency out of whole cloth. Mm-hmm. He and his founding team were finding furniture, finding office locations, buying fleet vehicles so we could travel the state, working on desks and computers and laptops, like literally full startup mode in building the agency and trying to figure out the initial rounds of licensing, drafting the initial regulations. And so that was early chapter of building a regulated cannabis economy completely out of thin air. We are in a very different place now than we were back then. At this stage in the market's growth, we have over 2,000 licenses issued. We have nearly 600 retailers now operational. We've generated nearly $3 billion in revenue to date. The office has over 260 staff now employed, and we're on pace to get up to 274 here in relatively short order. And so we're kind of out of the startup phase, and we're now entering the early maturation phase. And so I think what is needed at the executive level is going to be quite different now than it was in startup mode. I think part of the focus for this period of building the market is focusing on things like systems and process improvement and execution, ensuring that we are using our resources most efficiently and effectively to achieve the market's out. Part of our work is going to be about governance and ensuring that we are maintaining good oversight over this market that has grown so quickly, and ensuring that everyone is meeting their obligations under the letter of both law and regulations. Part of this is going to be about process improvement. Mm-hmm. We have 3 years worth of operational data to review and consider. And so some of this is kind of looking back and ensuring that
I wanted to ask you about that because unlike your predecessors who came from more traditional regulatory or legislative backgrounds, you worked as an industry analyst before joining OCM. So how does thinking like a market analyst rather than a regulator impact, how you're going to run the office?
Well, I can certainly say that part of the privilege of my experience prior to coming to the office is I spent most of my career working with high performance organizations, trying to help them use data, research, market intelligence to achieve mission critical objectives. And so sometimes that entailed reviewing processes and systems to determine whether they are optimized and identify ways in which processes can be optimized, looking out at the market and trying to identify how we can adapt the way we work to achieve new robust goals. And so I think my experience having worked in this industry I think could be of value or benefit in several ways. One is I do understand the cannabis industry intimately. I've spent over a decade kind of working with some of the industry's top organizations while in the private sector side, and 3 years in the policy role internal to OCM, spent a lot of time speaking to our licensees to understand what was working and what wasn't. Two is we also spent a lot of time thinking deeply about consumers. In my past life, we led some of the earliest studies, like really deep dives into who the cannabis consumer is, why they consume, and how their behavior was evolving post legalization. I think there's a lot more that we need to do here in New York to understand the New York's specific consumer in the context of our current live market. But I think it is really valuable to not only think about building a market, but also to think about who you're building the market for, to ensure that the needs of the end consumer are being met. It's something I find really important to keep reminding folks, because it does get lost, I think, in some of the discussions about what's happening in New York, is that legalization was not intended to create new consumers. The goal of legalization was not to have folks who've never consumed cannabis now walk into a dispensary and start buying cannabis. It's to take the over 2.2 million New Yorkers who are consuming cannabis regularly, the over 1.2 million who are consuming cannabis as frequently as other New Yorkers go into coffee shops to buy coffee, and making sure that those consumers have legal, effective, safer options in the market that we're building. And so really important that we think about who the consumer is that we're trying to serve, even as we try to build an industry that is safe and effectively regulated.
Well, speaking about consumers, you announced at the March 5th Cannabis Control Board meeting that New York hit 1.7 billion in sales in 2025, and that the state is on pace to hit 2.6 in this year, in 2026. For people who only heard about the disaster years, can you put those numbers into context? And then also please note that there are some people who say that New York at this point should be a $5 billion market. So what's the reality?
It's an interesting point to hear some say, New York should be a $5 billion market now. All I can say is all I can do is reflect on what we have been able to build so far. And I think what we have been able to build so far is an incredible growth engine for this legal industry. So first is just the fact that, in 3 years, we've already got 600 dispensaries open. And those 600 dispensaries were not medically transitioned dispensaries. These were all organically spun legal dispensaries. That's a major differentiation from most other adult use markets, where the medical market went first and then adult use was legalized.
And that was conscious.
We've opened
that was a
600
conscious
dispensaries.
decision by the OCM.
That's right. So our approach to building this market has been different, and I think we've covered the same amount of ground much faster because we've had to do it by opening new dispensaries. The fact that our market is growing by leaps and bounds, less than $1 billion in 2024, 1.7 this year, 2.6 for forecast for 2026, and over 3.5 going to 4 for 2028. These are really meaningful growth numbers, and somewhat conservative based on factors in the market that remain yet to be seen. And worth also noting that even as we have grown this market, I would argue very quickly, we've done so by richly diversifying our supply chain. Having a really good number of both cultivators and processors. And so you're seeing very rich product diversity emerging in the marketplace. But also, too, you're not seeing the same pace of price compression that you've seen in other regulated markets. And so, yes, we have seen about a 20 percentage point decrease in prices over the last 2.5 years or so. But worth noting, that's actually a smaller rate of price compression than you see in other jurisdictions. And I think part of that has been because we have been able to maintain a balance between supply and demand.
And, and that was actually my next question, was about the price compression. And is that just a natural evolution of the market? And, nothing wrong with the market, it's just what happens?
Yes and no. This is an issue that we've been paying really close attention to, and I'd approach it from two lenses. One, does price compression kind of naturally and organically happen in regulated markets? It does, no question about that. And there's several reasons why you would expect there to be natural price compression to happen. One is your producers just become more efficient the more that they do it. And so, most growers after 3 or 4 cultivation cycles will have dialed in their operations. They're getting a little bit more yield, and that allows them to price their products a little bit more aggressively. 2 is the markets become more competitive. If on day 1 you're starting off with 30 growers, and then by the end of year 2 you've got 300 growers, that competitive dynamic in the market will naturally lead to lower prices as folks are jockeying for space. Where I do think there is a material difference in approach between New York and some of our sister kind of regulated markets is how they've approached cultivation as out the gate in terms of issuing licenses to anyone who wants licenses without any consideration of what it might mean for the supply chain down the line. We have seen in some of the other major markets over about a 5-year period, prices be compressed between 60 and 75%. That's really, really aggressive. If you're used to getting, $100 an ounce and that drops to $25 an ounce, like you really have had to have dialed in your cultivation approach to be able to absorb that sort of price compression. And so part of what we're seeing in a lot of other jurisdictions, because the prices have cratered, one is cultivators and other suppliers going out of business. 2 is a lot of unpaid bills. 3 is a lot of incentive to divert product out of the legal market, sell it into the unregulated market, and potentially have it be inverted into a market like New York. And you end up having all of these other public safety and public health issues attendant to an oversupplied market. And so we're really concerned about this in New York. We spend a lot of time modeling out our supply chain and looking at our anticipated demand for the next few years. And part of what we're trying to do there is maintain some balance between the growth of demand and the growth of our supply, so we don't end up seeing these price compression dynamics that end up being so disruptive to the regulated market.
I want to shift gear a little bit. And you talked earlier about, one of the goals being to convert cannabis users from the illicit market to the legal market. Now, I want to go back to talk about Operation Padlock to Protect, which sealed nearly 1,400 unlicensed storefronts, seized over 95 million illicit products, which is tremendously impressive. But is the illicit market still worth billions? Is enforcement making a real dent, or are we still just playing a whack-a-mole?
Yeah, so if the legal market is, say, forecast to do $2.5 to $3 billion in legal sales this year, and we clearly believe that there's a lot more upside room for growth. It suggests that there is still, billions of dollars in untapped legal opportunity that is currently being served by the unregulated market.
Do you have a sense of what that number is in the illicit market right now?
So we are working on building our own kind of estimates for what unregulated demand could look like. We've seen other models in the market, in the industry, put New York's total addressable demand, so the total potential demand for cannabis in New York. Estimates range, but we've seen everything from about 4 billion to about 7 billion at the very top end. I think you probably end up getting in at around 5 to 6 billion as the total addressable demand in New York right now.
All right, so when you're talking about $5 billion in legal sales by 2028, you're really taking a huge chunk out of the illicit market at that point.
So yeah, we would be looking at about $4 billion by 2028 is our forecast. But yes, the goal is to continue to very significantly cannibalize the unregulated demand. So to answer your questions, yes, the unregulated market remains a priority for us because it's clear that even with 600 dispensaries open in the state, there's still a lot of unregulated operators in the state, and we want to make sure that we're targeting them. Our enforcement efforts have been somewhat hampered by, amongst other things, a lawsuit right now that has an injunction over the agency that has really changed our posture for intervening in these businesses, for investigating these businesses. So amongst the guidelines of this injunction, it says that we can only have 2 agents of the office in a facility inspecting it for unlicensed cannabis sales. 2, that we can only take immediate action if the illicit cannabis is in public sight of the main floor of the store. So if the illegal cannabis is behind a partition, is behind a closed door, then we can't intervene in that case. We would need to go and get a court order to be able to search the property. And so requiring that court order process, we've got to engage the Attorney General to submit the court order to the court, get it back, and then go and intervene, means that it becomes a much lengthier process than us being able to walk into a property that's suspected of conducting illegal sales and being able to search the premises. So it has slowed us down, but we continue undeterred. We're working to grow our enforcement unit as we speak. But this we have to work within the bounds of kind of the law and court orders. And so our progress has been somewhat impeded by this injunction in place. But even within the confines of the injunction, we continue to enforce against unlicensed operators, including we just announced this week or last week some enforcement action that we took up in the northern town of Watertown, where we padlocked 6 illicit dispensaries in one sweeping action. So the work continues.
Oh, absolutely. And visibly, you can see, as you walk through the city or, some of the towns upstate, just a marked difference from what it looked like in 2021, 2022, as far as the number of unlicensed dispensaries.
And, I think it's also worth noting that the drawdown that you've seen, these used to be really, really visible. And for folks who didn't come to New York during the go-go days of illicit dispensaries, it's a really marked difference. And some of that is a reflection of the incredible work that has been done by OCM's enforcement unit, as well as our state agency partners, including the Sheriff's Department and some of the municipal towns that are working with us. But some of that is also the unregulated market starting to see the writing on the wall. All else being equal, consumers do show a preference for legal cannabis over unregulated products, because they like the visibility, the sunshine, and transparency of the regulated market. Generally, the product selection does tend to be better in the legal market, especially for value-added products like beverages, which are really challenging to manufacture in an unregulated market. And so we continue to prioritize our enforcement actions, but we also do say that one of the best antidotes to the unregulated market is a robust, highly accessible, and cost-efficient legal market.
So there are now about 610, I know a few times you mentioned over 600 licensed cannabis stores in New York, with about 56% of those licenses going to social equity applicants. And social equity, as we all know, has been central to New York's model from the start. So in the next 1 to 2 years, what does success look like for those equity licensees? And what happens if the economics of the market doesn't support them surviving?
This is a really important question, and I think cuts to the heart of the deeply important work that Simone Washington, our Chief Equity Officer, is doing in kind of securing and stabilizing the equity mandate in our work. So first, I will say, New York's cannabis market is going to be incredibly competitive. That was, always an expectation here that, cannabis is a tough business and cannabis is a competitive business. And New York was never going to be an exception to that. The idea of our social equity mandate wasn't to undermine the free market or undermine competition in the market. It's just to make sure that everyone is playing by the same rules, that everyone has an equal opportunity at success. So first, I will continue to underscore that New York is going to be a very competitive industry, a very competitive market in which to do business. And so you've got to bring your A game, because this is New York, and it's true for every other sector of the economy. It's going to be equally true of cannabis. Two, as we think about how to think about success in New York as it relates to social equity, I'd put a few things in that list of things that we would be looking at. One is, have we provided adequate resources in an under-resourced kind of ecosystem? There's not a lot of capital, there's not a lot of training education available. It's a new industry, so there's not a lot of folks who have deep experience operating in these spaces and who have a deep experience understanding what makes cannabis different from the rest of the economy. So where the office has the ability to, have we provided all of the tools and resources possible to ensure that new entrants into this market are well positioned and have a good understanding of what they can expect? Two, are we enforcing kind of a level playing field? So, for agency operations like the Trade Practices Bureau, Are we leveraging our compliance unit, our trade practices bureau to make sure that everyone is playing by the same rules so that the best capitalized players in the market aren't gaining untoward or improper competitive or market advantages based on the fact that they have resources that smaller operators can't. There's plenty of ways that you can win in this market without having to break the rules. So making sure that folks are competing in an even way. And then three, and this is going to be led by the market, but and not by the office, but helping our businesses understand that just because you are a social and economic equity business doesn't give you a unique place in the consumer's mind. Mm-hmm. And so helping businesses understand that you've got to come with a differential advantage to this market. You've got to understand what your value proposition is and what you're offering and what makes it different. Just being a C business alone may not be enough to set you apart in what is going to be an incredibly competitive market. So we're really encouraging our businesses to think comprehensively and strategically about as this market gets more crowded, as it gets more competitive, how do you set yourself apart? Who are you targeting, and are you engaging them in a way that's most effective?
And you see that with the dispensaries. I mean, there are some that are building a real connection to their community and becoming part of the fabric of that community, and others that open the door and expect people to come running in.
Every cannabis market has had its first season where if you built it, they would come. I remember talking to some of the early movers in Colorado, and they were saying they opened their first cannabis dispensary with 3 jars of cannabis and in a storefront, and there were lines out the door because people were just so excited to buy illegal cannabis. That season ends fairly quickly. You may have been able to get away with the if you build it, they will come model in the first generation of this market where we had 50, 100 dispensaries. But as we start getting up to 600 dispensaries, 1,000 dispensaries, where consumers start having real choice in the neighborhoods where you're operating, I think it's going to be really incumbent on the dispensaries and on the brands being sold within those dispensaries to define what their value proposition is and ensure that they are offering the right product to the right customer at the right time.
Now, Governor Hochul has said that you embody what it means to serve others. And that's a really warm endorsement, but this is also a very high pressure seat. What does your working relationship with the governor look like? And how much runway do you have to make decisions independently?
Well, thank you for the question. I've been really heartened by the level of support that the governor's office has expressed toward the office as we enter this new stage of growth. Indeed, that express support was one of the influential considerations as we were thinking about this opportunity. I think the governor's team recognize what we're building here as a new economic engine, an opportunity or an engine for new opportunities within the state of New York. And I've been really excited by the support and resources that they're bringing to bear as we start building the next chapter of growth. I'm very comfortable with the relationship we have with the governor's office, obviously looking to continue to build it, deepen it, strengthen it. But I think we are off to a very, very strong start.
Well, congratulations. Now, the OCM sits at a very complicated intersection of equity goals, tax revenue, public health, law enforcement. And those priorities don't always align. Some of the newer legal cannabis jurisdictions don't have all that responsibility in the same agency. I'll give you 2 examples. In Maryland, there's a separate office responsible for cannabis equity. In Delaware, there's a different agency responsible for enforcement operations. Is this something New York State should consider? Is OCM being asked to do too much? And I'll say this before you say it, because you cannot really do more with less.
So maybe the first point I'd make is just a shout out to the team here, who are some of the most committed, resourceful, entrepreneurial, dynamic people I have ever had the privilege of working with. I don't think the market, the industry, the market, our stakeholders have a full appreciation for how much we have been able to do with a really small team. And I think that's going to continue apace. We are all in to continue doing this deep work. 2, on the question of, should some of the work be taken off of our portfolio? I don't think we're there yet. Look, as a state, we're currently quite resource constrained. Our workforce is going to grow likely fairly incrementally, just because that's going to be true statewide. And two, I think because we are still at a relatively young stage in building this market, I have two considerations. I think there's still work that we can do to optimize our operations to kind of get more out of this incredible engine that we've built. And two, I think the market is still quite young and still quite immature. And I think it might be a little bit premature to start substantially rearranging roles and responsibilities before we fully know what this market is going to look like in its end state. So, for example, enforcement, I think, is a good illustration. I do think we could use more enforcement resources just to target this issue that I'm concerned about as a major public health and public safety issue. But I can see, a potential future where maybe 5 years down the line, we've had such a robust impact on the unregulated market that we don't need a full army of enforcement field agents, or maybe we can work and collaborate a little bit more effectively with local municipalities so that they're carrying more of this rather than it being OCM directed.
And that's happened at the start, and you remember this, at the start, local law enforcement wanted nothing to do with OCM enforcement, but they have been cooperating over the last few years.
Yeah. And so I think there's the real opportunity for continued growth here. And I will say, without knowing much about how it is working in other states, I see a lot of utility in having equity, enforcement, compliance, licensing all under one umbrella, because our units need to speak to each other. Our chief equity officer has to be able to voice concerns about, say, issues related to enforcement or issues related to the implementation of equity with the rest of the leadership team that is responsible for implementing the other parts of this market. I think having these unit leads all be able to sit around a table, have open forums of discussion, identify issues from their vantage points, and be able to share that information. I think that's critically important. So, I would argue that there is utility in preserving the broad mandate of OCM under one umbrella. Yes, support with more resources as we can get them, but I think we have been working quite well as a diversified team of leaders all working to implement different aspects of this program.
According to the Rockefeller Institute, we still have a little less than half of New York municipalities that have opted out of dispensaries and a little more than half that have opted out of on-site consumption. First, do you have any idea when on-site consumption applications might be released? And second, what can OCM do to win over these municipalities? Is there a legislative solution that might be necessary?
Yeah, so we are working to solve for the on-site consumption authorization, permit, and license. There's a lot of considerations here that need to be addressed, including everything from, if it's going to be combustion, what do the rules for combustion look like? How do we meet the clean air obligations and ensure that the local municipalities are aligned with our expectations there? On the other side of the spectrum, if it's going to be, on-site consumption for, say, food products, what does cannabis-infused food actually look like? How do you manufacture it? How do you make it safe? How do you ensure consumers are well-oriented to dosing requirements, etc.? So there's a lot of issues under the umbrella of on-site that we are working through. We've got a team dedicated to working through these issues, but that work is ongoing. I don't want to get over my skis here on how quickly we'll be able to get on-site approved. But I can at least assure you that we are thinking very deeply about it, and we do want to get it right. It's just going to take us a while to iron that out. On the issue of munis and opt-outs, you correctly say, nearly half of the state has opted out of regulated cannabis. And I think this presents an opportunity for the office to really work on our education and outreach. I can understand some of the reservations that led communities to opt out of legal cannabis. Having spent 3 years looking quite closely at this issue, I think one of the things that is clear to me is prohibiting legal cannabis does not prohibit cannabis. What you end up doing, and what I think we've seen in a lot of the jurisdictions that opted out, is that you end up having this proliferation of unregulated stores that are much more difficult to contain, require a lot more resources on the enforcement standpoint. And it becomes really fertile territory because consumers want the products, they just don't have legal channels where they can get them. So I do think the office has its work cut out for us. We've got to do more outreach to communities that have opted out. I think we've got to explain the value proposition of legal cannabis against unregulated cannabis. This is not to say that we are encouraging people to go out and consume cannabis, but if you're going to consume it, probably better that you're participating in the legal market rather than the unregulated one, and helping communities understand the downside risks of not having a regulated market in place, and everything from having young adults, minors, going into to purchase cannabis when they shouldn't have access to these products. So our work is, we do have some work we need to do there for sure. And I'm hoping that's something that we can focus on over the next couple of years. Do we need a legislative solution? I'm certainly not going to be one to speak to what the legislature should be doing. I would, based on the agreements that were made to legalize cannabis in New York, I would obviously be cautious about imposing it on communities. I think it's always much better when solutions to these sorts of regional challenges are found in a collaborative way. And so we are committed to working with any municipality that is willing to speak with us and that may be interested in learning how to deploy an effectively regulated program within their jurisdictions.
But you do agree that expanding the map of licensed cannabis in New York is of critical importance? I
do. I think it's critically important so that we can serve the consumers in those jurisdictions who want access to legal cannabis. I think it's critically important so that we can address the unregulated and more effectively address the unregulated operators within those jurisdictions. And I think it benefits the local jurisdictions because of the tax revenue that they could be earning. 4% of regulated tax revenues. It might have seemed like not a lot of money when we were a sub-billion-dollar program. I think those numbers start to feel quite different when we're doing, $3.5–4 billion in legal sales in a couple of years.
Mm-hmm. Now, John, you call this appointment an extraordinary privilege. Why are you, at this moment, the right person to lead the New York cannabis market?
That's a very unfair question.
It is. But you know what? Let me start off by saying I agree. I think you are the right person at this time.
So, look, I serve at the pleasure of the governor and the pleasure of her team. It is a privilege to me because of how important this program is to so many people, both for what it represents in New York as I would argue, one of the most consequential social changes and social experiments in a generation, but also what New York's program signals to the rest of the country, to the rest of the world, about New York's recognition of the harms of prohibition and the opportunity presented by legal cannabis. It's a privilege because, as somebody who had long studied legal markets across the world, never in a million years did I think I was going to be a regulator, but if I'd always thought if I was ever going to do this, New York would probably be the only market I'd consider doing it, because of the consequence of New York's market. It's the world's most influential market. It's going to be a global center of innovation, and I think it's the most opportunity-rich market in the country, particularly for folks who are focused more on building small and medium-sized businesses, because that's how the market's been structured. I appreciate that the state leadership and with the support of the industry have felt that my experience both in the private sector and in the public sector would be of value in stewarding this market to its next chapter. I take that responsibility incredibly gravely, and I will say to anyone who will listen, I will move hell and high water to try and help get this market into its next chapter of growth and realize the potential that continues to build here. It's a huge amount of work. I have no illusions about that. Mm-hmm. It's very hard work. I certainly have no illusions about that. But I'm excited for the challenge, and I'm excited to collaborate with some of the most extraordinary builders I've ever had the privilege of working with.
Before we conclude, John, is there anything else you'd like to add, anything that we didn't speak about?
Well, so in thinking about what is next for New York's market, there's a couple of initiatives that I'd love to just call out as things I would want your listeners to be thinking about as we get into the second and third quarter. So first, we are a learning organism. We're a learning organization. And one of the ways that I'd like to reflect that is by taking a look at our regulations, the regulations that are currently governing this market. Mm-hmm. Most of these regs were written before the we had our first dispensary open. We now have 3 years worth of data and insight and perspective on whether these rules are actually doing what we expected them to do in regulating this market. And so we've undertaken a reg review process where we're reviewing our entire package of regulations, looking for ways in which we can sharpen our pencils, increase efficiency, reduce the cost and effort of compliance enforcement, reduce the regulatory burden on our licensees, and hopefully kind of stimulate greater market efficiency.
And that's not just an exercise that's going on in-house. You're actually conducting a listening tour.
Exactly right. So we began this as an internal exercise, soliciting input from all of our teams. The second part is going to be a series of roundtables. We're doing 2 upstate, Buffalo and Mid-Hudson, 2 downstate in the boroughs, and 1 online. And the idea here is to solicit feedback from both stakeholders and the general public on what aspects of our regulations we can improve on, build upon, sharpen. Critically important, and we hope that folks are going to share their feedback with us. We're not committing that we will make every single change that is proposed, but what a timely opportunity to give feedback to the office on what you think is working well and where you think there's room for improvement.
All right. Well, thank you for your time today. John Kagia, Acting Executive Director of the New York State Office of Cannabis Management. Thank you.
Absolute pleasure, Herb. Thank you.